Hello, I'm Sarah Clover, and this is the Agent of Change podcast, where we examine all things and everything to do with the Agent of Change principle. And I wanted to take a short detour from some of the immediate practicalities of the Agent of Change principle to look at another interesting area of its development, another portion of the historical chronology as to how we have come to be where we currently are with the Agent of Change principle. And I wanted to look in this chapter at the treatment of the Agent of Change principle in the House of Lords, and particularly in the House of Lords Select Committee that considered the Licensing Act 2003 and conducted the 10-year review of the Licensing Act 2003 between 2016 and 2017. And I have to declare something of a personal interest in this particular chapter in Agent of Change history, because I was the specialist advisor to that House of Lords Select Committee, and it was fascinating to see how that committee detoured slightly from their licensing remit to take into account planning issues, which was almost inevitable given the range of the considerations that they needed to look at. But it was fascinating to see how that committee joined the dots and came to the conclusions that they actually did. So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time looking at that, just to fill in some more gaps as to how Agent of Change reaches us in the form that it currently does. Now, we know that there is a very close relationship between planning and licensing, and that relationship is at the heart of the Agent of Change principle, because, of course, we are typically talking about the relationship between planning, the built development, often the residential development that gets planning permission in close proximity to a noise source, a noisy business, which will very often be one that's got a license for music, a license for people to go and drink and be entertained and to stay up late and to do all the things that tend to cause noise and very often to upset the local neighbours. So that's the battle line, as it were, for the Agent of Change principle in action. So the licence that the noisy business has got and the planning permission that the built development wants are two sides to a large extent of the same coin. And those departments, together with the Environmental Protection or the Environmental Health Department that will be mediating and enforcing any complaints that might arise in the future, those are the three departments within the council that need to have a special relationship with each other when it comes to looking at these particular issues and problems. The planning department is a statutory consultee. It is a responsible authority within the licensing regime. And so to that extent, it was on the table for consideration by the House of Lords Select Committee. And part and parcel of their call for evidence was to find out how responsible authorities and the different responsible authorities engage in the licensing process. And so inevitably one of the questions that they asked was, how frequently and to what extent does the planning responsible authority, the planning department, engage in licensing decisions? And the answer that they received, somewhat to their surprise, was there is relatively little engagement by the planning officers in the licensing regime. And when they inevitably asked the question, why is that? They got the answer because it's perceived that those two things have nothing to do with each other. Planning is planning and licensing is licensing. And not only are those two regimes encouraged to operate pretty much in watertight compartments, there is even case law that suggests that that should be so. And that is certainly how culturally matters have developed within local authorities as decision makers. Planning and licensing regard themselves as separate and not to have the very close relationship that it might be perceived that they could or perhaps even should have. And certainly that was the view of the House of Lords Select Committee. They found this a surprising situation, that planning officers do not typically put in a consultation response to a licence application. Now, licensing and planning obviously relate very closely together, not least for the noisy businesses that will need both of those authorisations in order to conduct their activities. And this was a part of the evidence that came to the House of Lords from numerous quarters in their call for evidence, very typically from residents and from councillors who made many submissions along the lines of, we cannot understand why these two regimes do not talk to each other, and how it can be that premises can get a licence for certain things and certain hours when they haven't got planning permission, or they have a planning permission which has more restrictions and conditions upon it than the licence has got, and that these two authorisations do not seem to match up, and we can't make them match up, and we don't know why. And the House of Lords committee didn't really know why either, and it led them down a certain path, and some of their recommendations are particularly interesting to read in general terms. There is a particular recommendation all about agent of change. But just before we go to that, I just wanted to look at what the final report, which came out in spring of 2017, said about this relationship between licensing and planning. And they said this at paragraph 117 of the report, the integration of licensing and planning. They said, as our inquiry progressed, at the same time that we were receiving evidence of problems with the licensing system, we were hearing of the difficulties caused by the separation between licensing and planning, and it became clear to us that the two problems are closely related. In our call for evidence, we asked, should licensing policy and planning policy be integrated more closely to shape local areas and address the proliferation of licensed premises, and how could it be done? An overwhelming majority of respondents criticised the current lack of coordination between licensing and planning and thought there should be better integration. And we were given numerous examples of the absurdities caused by the separation of the systems, especially for applicants for new premises which need permission for both planning and licensing, and for whom permission for one without the other is of no use. So that's how they identified the problem, and then they came to their conclusions. And the conclusion of the Select Committee was radical. They said this, our conclusion, paragraph 152. If, as we think, it is not only permissible but logical to look at licensing as an extension of the planning process, it would have been sensible for the Licensing Act to transfer the powers of licensing justices to the planning committees of local authorities, rather than to set up a new and untried system of licensing committees with a new and different procedure, new staffing, and a new appellate process. Instead, the result has been that each local authority has been able to deal with all aspects of land use through a planning committee, with the single exception of licensed premises, which require a separate committee and a separate mechanism. And now that the system has been in operation for 11 years, we believe that this can be seen to have been a mistake and a missed opportunity. Paragraph 153 says, we recognise that a suggestion that licensing committees should be abolished and their work amalgamated with that of planning committees is a radical one. It's not a change which should be made without first being trialled over a small but representative sample of local authorities over perhaps 2 years. And that they continued in that vein, but that was the nature of their recommendation, that in fact licensing committees should be subsumed within planning committees, and really to that extent the two systems should be merged. Now that was undoubtedly radical, and there would be a number of elements of that proposal that would need significant further thought and work. As it happens, it never came to that point. The government simply did not accept that recommendation at all, and there is no prospect of licensing and planning being fused in that way. And really, that chapter of the report and those recommendations should be looked at in the sense of an interesting analysis of the nature of the problems that arise with this disconnect between licensing and planning, which is still a problem. That has not gone away. Now, what the report did do was to stimulate that debate and further analysis, particularly within the Home Office. This is all pre-pandemic, when the luxury was available to think about other things than COVID and coronavirus regulations. But at that time, a couple of years ago, there were in fact some workshops that were conducted jointly between the Home Office and the Institute of Licensing, with a very wide range of stakeholders who came along to debate the House of Lords recommendations and to look at some of the issues and to see what practical steps could be taken to integrate planning and licensing to a greater degree. And that work, to some extent, pandemic permitting, is ongoing and will no doubt be used to inform consultation responses and advisory pieces to the government and MHCLG in particular around the planning reform that is on the table and the planning bill that is envisaged. So that's a work in progress and still it is one to watch. The report also dealt with the agent of change, particularly having got their teeth well and truly into planning and seeing clearly what that relationship was like between licensing and planning. The committee went on to look at agent of change particularly. And further on in the report, and at paragraph 543, they said this: agent of change principle. The evidence we heard has highlighted the need to consider how licensed premises which put on live music performances are to be accommodated and protected in the UK's towns and cities, when the need for housing and residents accompanying expectations of quiet living environments are ever more pressing. And one of the most frequent suggestions we heard was to introduce a full agent of change principle into UK planning law. This would require anyone instigating a new building development or a change in land use, the agent precipitating a change in a given area, to take into account the nearby properties and their functions. If there was a reason to believe that the functions of the new property or conversion would clash with those of the pre-existing properties, it would fall to the agent of change to take actions to mitigate this clash. Now, within the report, the committee also highlighted the evidence that was given to them about agent of change from a number of local authorities. Birmingham was highlighted, Leeds was also highlighted, and it's quite interesting if you're into this kind of thing to get a hold of a copy of the report and actually look and see what those different authorities were saying to the select committee. But to wrap it up, the recommendation that came out of the report at paragraph 553 was as follows. They said, we recommend that a full agent of change principle be adopted in both planning and licensing guidance to help protect both licensed premises and local residents from consequences arising from any new built development in their nearby vicinity. So more proof, if proof were needed, that agent of change is not a brand new concept. It has been considered and regarded and debated a number of times over relatively recent years, but it was of great interest to the House of Lords Select Committee, who did not consider when they first started their 10-year review of the Licensing Act 2003 that they would be looking quite so much at planning. But it is an indication of how closely those regimes work and need to work together. And the recommendation of the committee, having heard all the evidence, was very clear and in line with essentially what happened then in 2018 with the changes to the NPPF. But that, as we have noted a number of times now, is policy only, and the committee was really looking at something a little bit more solid and enduring in terms of introducing the agent of change principle into full planning and licensing law and guidance. So I wanted just to take that little journey and look at the House of Lords recommendations. It's part of the jigsaw puzzle that makes up agent of change, and we will be moving on in different chapters to look at some of the practicalities that arise. So that is the chapter for today. Thank you very much indeed for listening. I'm Sarah Clover. I'm from King's Chambers, and this is the Agent of Change podcast.